So we're talking with Micah Reddy in South Africa, and Micah works for the nonprofit AmaBunghani. Can you tell us a little bit about the group that you work for, Micah?
Sure, John. So it was established in, about over a decade ago now, 2009, if I'm not mistaken. And it's a non-profit investigative center. So it was sort of housed, it's always been independent, but it was housed within a established weekly publication in South Africa. And some years back, it went fully independent. Well, it split from the Mail and Guardian, and it is a donor-funded investigative center. The funding consists of institutional donors, but the single largest source of funding comes from ordinary donations, small donations from members of the public. And we tend to focus on sort of the intersection of politics and crime. So really we look at kind of high-level corruption and various things in between. Of course, there's an increasing focus on the environment these days. You may have heard about the Gupta leaks. That was sort of something that really cemented our reputation in recent years. That was looking at, it was a series of exposés on high-level state capture in South Africa, linked to one particular family of Indian origin who had become very close to the president of the country and the faction around the president.
I should have asked this. So what does AmaBunghani mean?
Good question. It means, it's the Zulu word for dung beetles. It's kind of a local spin on muckraking. It's kind of,
And AmaBunghani recently was at the center of a controversy concerning the closing of that journal New Frames, which also involves Neville Roy Singham. Can you tell us a little bit about that whole issue?
New Frame was founded in 2018, I think it was. And it was set up to be this kind of radical left voice in the media landscape, to give a voice to workers and to focus very much on union issues, poor and working class communities, that sort of thing. And it was a welcome addition to the media landscape in South Africa. The media landscape is, like in so many countries, quite concentrated, and of course, I use this term not uncritically, but mainstream media has its kind of certain preoccupations and biases. And New Frame was to bring a radical left perspective to the media landscape. It was a publication that was unashamedly leftist, proudly leftist, but was also supposed to be independent and non-partisan. It suddenly came onto the media scene, and it was unclear where the money was coming from, but it was evidently very well resourced. So they moved into fancy offices downtown. They seemed to have a lot of money to pay staff and to pay freelancers, and they had a solid core of staff. And there wasn't another sort of high caliber left-wing publication. There's some sort of soft left publications and vaguely left-leaning, left liberal publications, but this was going to be something, this promised to be something genuinely radical. But there were certain questions around transparency and funding, and those questions continued to linger. It was always sort of rumored to be linked to NUMSA and to be part of this kind of NUMSA project, and I'll get into that a bit later, but it didn't seem to be a mouthpiece of any trade union or any political party. But it had a minuscule readership and really didn't have much impact, even within the left. And, the left in South Africa is it's fairly is a fairly small space. It came across as a kind of ivory tower publication, very sort of insulated from the media world and the news cycle, and there were some particularly bad takes that were very much ideologically driven. But it read like a kind of look. There was some. Don't get me wrong. There were some good journalists, but a lot of it read as this kind of like very um, heavy, dry, you know, academic treaties and that kind of thing.
And you said there was a few things that were ideologically driven. Can you talk about?
Yeah. So for instance, um, you know about the July riots last year. That was so there were these massive riots middle of last year that were sparked by the arrest of the former president Jacob Zuma on well that was for contempt of court.
Mm-hmm.
The Constitutional Court ordered his arrest, um, and that sparked mass riots across the country, particularly in KZN and in KwaZulu Natal, which is where he's from. That's his sort of stronghold, and in Gauteng, which is the economic hub of the country. And New Frame was very quick to publish an editorial, and I don't think this editorial had buy-in from the staff more broadly. I think it was very much one man's decision, the editor-in-chief, Richard Pithouse. And it was very quick to sort of portray the riots as bread riots, as a sort of genuine popular uprising driven by hunger or political disaffection. But mm-hmm. And so it kind of glossed over the riots as this sort of noble grassroots act of I don't know, revolutionary proletarian disobedience and violence.
And
which you know, there was an element of truth to that, in the sense that, you know, the mass disaffection and frustration, unemployment, poverty, hunger all fed into it, obviously. But they were very political, and New Frame intentionally turned a blind eye. New Frame intentionally ignored the political dynamics of it, or downplayed the political dynamics of it. And the Zuma connection, and the extent to which these riots were planned and stoked and orchestrated. And then so it completely, you know, it completely whitewashed these riots, and it was so that's what I mean by it was a kind of quick ideological take. It was a reflex ideological take that came at the expense of rigorous, you know, journalistic analysis.
And then one day, New Frame just suddenly closed its doors.
Well, so that's the thing. So it never really, as I was saying, it never really had much traction. It never really had much of a following or a readership. There was a kind of arrogance that, you know, we're better than all the other media. We know best. And it very much was about, I think, it was very much, that had very much to do with the personality of Richard Pithouse. Who was a sort of central figure in all of this. Although he was booked off sick for a long time, I mean, he very much defined this organization and brought his politics to bear on it. It was perceptible in things like the editorials and certain editorial decisions, but also I think in the general tone, which was this kind of patronizing, didactic, you know, very academic tone. And I think it alienated a lot of would-be readers. A lot of, you know, people were excited at the thought of a radical left-wing publication, but it never really gained traction. New Frame collapsed earlier this year. The decision was suddenly announced, and it took some people by surprise. Some people suddenly remembered there was this very promising, well, this left-wing publication that was very well funded and held a lot of promise at one stage. Even a publication like New Frame, which had very little traction, very limited readership, its closure was still felt by the media fraternity. And just like the media fraternity had welcomed New Frame as bringing more diversity and kind of critical left perspective, I think, you know, as much as that was the case, they were also shocked that New Frame was suddenly closing up shop when it had seemed so flush. There was so much money going around. And so that prompted us to ask, well, what was the reason for the sudden closure? New Frame had been loaded, had been sitting on a treasure chest for a long time, had been pumped full of money by this Roy Singham, and that was a kind of open secret that Roy Singham was the funder. And we had actually looked into him some time back when we were looking into NUMSA, the union that is kind of connected to Roy Singham through money flows, and that New Frame was sort of a part of. But when New Frame closed, we thought, okay, well, we need to start asking questions about the funding. And we were hearing all sorts of things, all sorts of allegations from New Frame's staff who were outraged and who felt like they'd been, betrayed and treated terribly as media workers by this ostensibly, radical left-wing publication and its management. And so, they came to us. A lot of allegations were made quite publicly on social media about the sudden decision to pull funding, and there was a lot of quite conspiratorial takes floating around. One of which was that the closure of New Frame had to do with Singham's reprioritization, basically, that he was reprioritizing his philanthropic initiatives, if you will, and that he was supposedly he was taking orders from the Chinese Communist Party, and there was some grand plan to kind of reorient the left, bring it more into China's fold. And as is the case with a lot of conspiracy, there seemed to be a kernel of truth, and certainly there were a lot of questions raised. And those questions were only heightened. Those questions were only added to by an editorial that Richard Pitthouse wrote, which was very revealing in what it didn't say. Basically, the editorial was saying something along the lines of, well, in a world of finite resources where the left is always under-resourced, there are better things to be spending money on than a left-wing publication. So basically, it was kind of apologia for the funder. It was making all sorts of excuses for the funder's decision to suddenly pull funding in a harsh, quite brutal way, actually. So that got us asking questions, and that led us to the article that we wrote, which was all about the funder and his links to the Chinese Communist Party, and how that was sort of influencing funding decisions and the kind of network of political organizations, think tanks, civil society organizations, call them what you will, but this cluster of left-wing organizations in South Africa and in other countries linked to Singham. And the sort of crux of the article was that his money was being channeled and used in quite opaque, unaccountable ways, and that these organizations were, like New Frame, pretty much entirely beholden to this one murky funder, and that his proximity to the Chinese Communist Party and his sort of pro-China ideology was having a discernible impact on this political network. A lot of accusations coming from the staff at New Frame centered on censorship. And there were accusations that New Frame had taken an overtly pro-China line and was kind of becoming more and more of a mouthpiece for the Chinese Communist Party. Now, those claims to me seemed somewhat overstated. In fact, it was quite hard to discern. There were articles here and there. There were certainly silences, but one could also speculate that New Frame was closed because it wasn't pro-China enough, because the journalists were pushing back and it was kind of too independent for this network. And the network, as I said, consists of all these sort of think tanks and media outlets and civil society organizations that all have that are all. I mean, it's quite a sort of thick um, mesh. It's quite a thick network of organizations in the sense that there's so many of them, and they all overlap in quite kind of sort of tight knit ways. So you have overlapping directorships. Um, the same people keep cropping up in management in these different organizations.
And can you be a little more
And
specific about that?
um, I can. Okay, so they're not limited to South Africa. Singham funds a lot of activity, a lot of political organizations in places like Brazil as well, and India. And the pattern is very much the same, the sort of the way that these organizations are set up. But in South Africa, for instance, um, you had New Frame, you had the sort of holding company for New Frame. The directors of the holding company for New Frame, in turn, were linked to NUMSA. They were linked to Pan Africa Today, which was this sort of political education initiative that was very involved in political education within NUMSA. The story of how Singham got into NUMSA. Sorry, it's a very sprawling story, but the story of how Singham got into NUMSA is also very interesting. So you had Pan Africa Today, you had um, things like the Tricontinental. Now, the Tricontinental, you may have heard of, it's quite influential in the international left. It's headed by a man called Vijay Prashad.
Yes.
And Tricontinental in South Africa. Yeah, so Richard was very involved. Richard Pitthouse, the editor of New Frame, was very involved in Tricontinental. So were certain people who were in NUMSA, and NUMSA's political offshoot as well, the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party, had a lot of key people in that were linked to, had been employed by Singham and were linked to Singham's other organizations. So there was that kind of thing. It was that was sort of the pattern of these overlapping organizations that shared the same managers and directors and so forth. And he funds a lot of sort of radical media organizations, it would seem. And these radical media organizations tend to take quite a hard line on issues around, Western imperialism, China, Russia. Very much towing the official Chinese Communist Party line on topics like the ethnic cleansing of and persecution of Uyghurs and that kind of thing.
Right.
I should point out that a lot of the money, Singham's money, was traceable to U.S. foundations. U.S. foundations have to file, U.S. nonprofits have to file tax returns that are publicly available, and so there were a bunch of foundations that were traced to Singham, and for that we owe some debt to this article that was published in New Lines. You may be familiar with it. I think we spoke about it once. Yeah, and what was interesting is that they were very obviously connected to Singham, but Singham had used a sort of fronting financial mechanism, if you will, to hide his money. So the money was routed through the Goldman Sachs Philanthropy Fund, which is a kind of which basically anonymizes funders for philanthropic initiatives. And from there, a whole lot of money. And this was around the time that Singham had sold his very successful tech company. What is it called now? ThoughtWorks. And there was public information basically showing that Singham had sold ThoughtWorks so that he could get more involved in his sort of philanthropic initiatives in radical politics, basically. And so at around that time, this money starts flowing from the Goldman Sachs Philanthropy Fund into various foundations linked to Singham, staffed by former ThoughtWorks employees, people close to Singham. And from there, we could see, money going to New Frame and going to various causes around the world. A lot of money going to Brazil, other parts of Africa. I mean, there's pretty serious money going to lots of different places, but some of it was traceable to South Africa. Tricontinental loomed large in all of that.
I asked the question about the closing of New Frame and how much of it had to do with tensions between the reporters and management around what would and would not be covered.
There certainly were some silences on major issues, but also, as Pithouse himself said, uh, it was very much a South African publication with a South African focus. They didn't have reporters or freelancers in places like Ukraine, um, and his sort of alibi, if you will, was that these weren't sort of deliberate silences. That these weren't for political reasons. It was just a matter of practicalities. It was a matter of practicalities and resources, and that they just couldn't tackle these issues. He says that he said that they never got. He said at one stage, I think that he acknowledged that there wasn't a major article on the Uyghurs, but and I'm pretty sure that's what the issue was. But one of those kind of big issues. He said yes, it was true that there wasn't some major article on that issue, but we'd also New Frame had never actually received a pitch. Um, and he basically accused some of the journalists of hypocrisy because he said, well, yes, you say that we never published on this, that, or the other, but you never pitched anything or you never proposed anything. You were silent all along. And he was saying that, there were certain kind of material constraints. There were, there were various kind of practical constraints that prevented them or that meant that they didn't cover certain things as much as maybe they should have or they would have liked or whatever. And it was plausible. There were quite like finicky examples of stories being spiked, and the reasoning was very kind of intricate, and there's a lot of he said, she said, and it was hard to kind of determine who was in the right, who was in the wrong. But there were some articles that were spiked that were critical of. In one case, there was an article that was critical of the junta in Myanmar that was spiked, and one of the journalists alleged that there was, that there was a political reason for that. That it was a case of censorship. To me, it was very unclear. There didn't seem to be a sort of systemic um, level of censorship at New Frame. But I don't think ultimately that wasn't that important to the story. What I think cannot be denied is that this publication was entirely beholden to a single, very unaccountable, murky funder, and I think it was killed for political reasons. I think that case can be made. I mean, I don't know for sure, and maybe the funder had a kind of a change of heart that had to do with purely financial considerations or material considerations. But to me, that is not convincing. And the matter is made all the murkier by the lack of accountability from the editor-in-chief and the funder himself. I mean, they haven't been frank about, the funder is still treated as this kind of secretive, mysterious man in the background. There's a lack of willingness to even name him, and I think that says a lot. And I think the fact that that Richard Pithouse just wouldn't come clean, wouldn't take the public into his confidence and disclose the real reasons for this very abrupt, brutal closure of New Frame, only underscored the importance of writing the story. And so one can speculate whether it was political reasons, but I think there's a compelling case to be made. We know a fair amount about the funder and his ties to the Chinese Communist Party. It would seem, if one takes a step back and looks at this network as a whole, New Frame is a bit of an outlier, because the network is very overtly pro-China. there's a very strong sort of propagandistic there's a very strong propagandistic current running through this network. And so one has to ask, well, what were the political considerations here? And could New Frame have been closed because it didn't sort of fit politically anymore? It was no longer politically expedient. It was potentially politically costly to this program, to this kind of pro-China project. And I think there's a good case to be made for that. I certainly think the silences from people from people in this network, and not just the silences, the extremely defensive responses, and really unhinged attacks on us after writing that article. I think
I asked about the attacks on AmaBunghani for their coverage of the closure of New Frames. These attacks included from Monthly Review Online here in the United States, which at that time I did not understand. Monthly Review Online is not exactly the same as Monthly Review, although I'm told that it's the same editors.
And the Monthly Review piece was part of a kind of wave, a barrage of very crude hit pieces on us in response to this article that I initially thought would get very little traction because it was about this niche left publication that no one ever read.
So,
and this kind of only confirmed the idea that there was some sort of network at play here. And I would just say that I was appalled by Monthly Review. A similar article was written in Common Dreams that one of the authors of the Monthly Review piece had written. And Common Dreams did at least make some attempt to kind of acknowledge that, that we hadn't been given right of reply. There were certain basic journalistic failings, and they incorporated a brief response by us. But the Monthly Review piece offered no real evidence, and actively they misquoted on the odd occasion they tried to offer something as evidence. It was invariably either totally misleading or misquoted, or just an outright fabrication. Like crazy sort of logical leaps were made, and it was a mess. And we wrote to Monthly Review complaining and pointing out with evidence. It was as sort of explicit as the authors having taken a quote from one of our funders' documents, and they could only deliberately have distorted that. It was a very, very obvious distortion. And we pointed this out. We included the document, we included the phrase, we included the relevant sentences, everything. And Monthly Review, refused to, not even talking about making a full retraction here, but just make the corrections. It was, I could go into the details and spend a lot of time going through each and every line of that article.
I commented on what appears to be a widespread and very well-funded political network that plays upon the legitimate anger at and the crimes of capitalism in the West, and they use that to cover over the equal crimes of capitalism in China and Russia.
Yeah, and we see that in South Africa. It's a major feature of our increasingly bankrupt politics at the moment. This term radical economic transformation and these empty left-wing slogans are thrown around to give a veneer of legitimacy to the most venal and corrupt factions of it's not just the ruling party, but within our politics. And there is a kind of ideological affinity for Russia and a certain material interests at work as well, Russia and China. I think this sort of thing is quite easily weaponized. And we saw that during the Gupta years. I referred to the Guptas earlier, very close to the former president, years of rampant state capture. And interestingly enough, Bell Pottinger, the infamous British former PR company, The firm that represented the likes of Augusto Pinochet and some of the, I think, Assad and some of the world's worst tyrants. That that Bell Pottinger was hired by the Guptas to kind of, well, to act as their PR firm and to provide them talking points and media training and that sort of thing. Well, to basically run the Gupta PR machine. And they, one very interesting thing to come out of investigative exposés of years was how Bell Pottinger had helped instrumentalize the slogan of radical economic transformation and these kind of left-wing slogans to give a veneer of legitimacy to state capture.
During the struggle against apartheid in the 1980s, the South African Communist Party was generally seen as being the most revolutionary sector of that struggle, and it had widespread support. However, it was continued to be linked with the leadership of the ANC, and in recent years, the ANC has really been the ruling capitalist party. In 2012, the striking miners at Marikana were massacred by the ANC with the complicity, really, of much of the union leadership. So I asked, how did that affect the support for the South African Communist Party?
The SACP is thoroughly compromised in that sense, having been effectively, having been in a tripartite alliance with the ANC, from the time the ANC was a governing party. So the ANC governs alongside COSATU, the Union Federation, and the SACP. And the SACP is a shadow of its former self. It's become this kind of very sort of stodgy, old-fashioned communist party. I think it long ago lost its any semblance of being a sort of genuinely radical force in South African politics.
Micah talked about the role of Russia and China in South Africa today.
Look, I mean, China is very present in South Africa, but it's not felt in the same way as, say, I think of like various African countries, Mozambique, and where you'll drive along newly tarred roads that were built by Chinese road crews or Chinese construction firms and new Chinese made buses, and you see it's much more visible. You see Chinese work teams everywhere. It's not quite the same here. That said, Chinese investment, China is a major economic player, but it's not quite as visible and tangible. Russia, I would say Russian economic interests possibly have a more discernible sort of political influence, certainly on the ruling party, because the ruling party, quite interestingly, ruling party has significant business relationships through mining ventures with Viktor Vekselberg, the Russian oligarch. So it's those kinds of things where you can sort of feel the hidden hand of Russia in South African politics.
That concluded my interview with Micah Reddy, and I want to thank him very much for taking the time, and I hope that we can return to discussing these issues with him and other people in South Africa in the future.